For more than a decade, the world has quietly watched the distance grow between one of Hollywood's most powerful stars and his only biological daughter. It didn't happen overnight. There was no single headline, no explosive interview, no dramatic public confrontation. Instead, the separation unfolded slowly, in silence, through absence, choices, and time. What makes this story so unsettling is not what was said, but what was never said. And for many people watching from the outside, that silence has spoken louder than any words ever could. Suri was born into a level of fame most people can't even imagine. From the moment her name was announced, cameras followed her every step. But despite being the daughter of one of the most famous actors in the world, she did not grow up in the spotlight the way many celebrity children do. Instead, she grew up mostly out of view, shielded, protected, and eventually separated from her father. Now, as she has grown older and begun making her own choices, people have started to look back and ask a difficult question. How did it all go so wrong? To understand how things reached this point, we have to go back to where it all began. The story starts in 2005, when Tom Cruise and Katie Holmes first crossed paths. At the time, Katie was a rising star. She was best known for her role on Dawson's Creek, where she played the girl next door that audiences instantly loved. She was young, hopeful, and still finding her place in Hollywood. Tom Cruise, on the other hand, was already a legend. He wasn't just famous, he was one of the most recognizable faces on the planet. His movies dominated box offices, and his name alone could sell a film. Years before they ever met, Katie had once mentioned in an interview that she dreamed of marrying Tom Cruise. At the time, it sounded like an innocent celebrity crush. Something many young fans might say without ever expecting it to come true. But in a twist that felt almost unreal, that dream soon became reality. When Tom and Katie began dating, the media exploded. Cameras followed them everywhere. Every smile, every touch, every public appearance was analyzed and discussed. Their relationship moved incredibly fast. Within weeks, they were openly declaring their love. Tom, who had always been known as private and controlled, suddenly appeared completely transformed. The most unforgettable moment came when he appeared on The Oprah Winfrey Show. In a scene that would become one of the most talked-about moments in television history, Tom jumped on the couch, shouting about how in love he was. Some people saw it as pure passion. Others saw it as unsettling, but no one could look away. In April 2006, their daughter Suri was born. Tom described it as the happiest day of his life. He spoke openly about how much he loved his daughter and how she changed everything for him. To the public, this looked like the perfect Hollywood fairy tale. A powerful movie star, a beautiful actress, and a baby who seemed to represent their love. But behind the scenes, there were already signs that not everything was as perfect as it seemed. One of the biggest differences between Tom and Katie was their belief systems. Tom Cruise was deeply committed to the Church of Scientology. It wasn't just a religion to him, it was a guiding force in his life. Katie, however, was raised Catholic. She came from a traditional Midwestern family, and the world she had entered was completely unfamiliar to her. During Katie's pregnancy and Suri's birth, Scientology practices played a major role. One of these practices was known as silent birth, where the delivery room remains quiet to avoid stress on the baby. Tom even went as far as buying his own ultrasound machine to monitor the pregnancy. To some people, this seemed like dedication. To others, it felt excessive and controlling. At the time, Katie appeared to go along with it all, smiling for the cameras and saying the right things. Later that same year, Tom and Katie married in a lavish ceremony in Italy. The wedding looked like something out of a movie. A historic castle, designer clothes, famous guests, and endless media attention. But while the world celebrated, Katie's parents were quietly worried. They watched as Scientology became a bigger presence in their daughter's life, and they feared what that might mean for her future, and for their granddaughter. What no one could see clearly at the time was that this fairy tale was already beginning to crack. And at the center of it all was a little girl who would one day grow up in the shadow of a love story that didn't last. By the late 2000s, Tom Cruise and Katie Holmes were seen as Hollywood royalty. They appeared on red carpets together, traveled on private jets, and graced the covers of magazines around the world. To the public, they looked unbreakable. A powerful actor, a devoted wife, and a child growing up surrounded by luxury. But behind the cameras, things were far more complicated. Friends and observers began to notice small changes in Katie. She was rarely seen alone. When she went out, she was often accompanied by people connected to Tom or his inner circle. These weren't bodyguards in the traditional sense, but individuals who seemed to always be nearby, watching, listening, present. Some journalists and insiders later described it as an environment where privacy barely existed. Katie's behavior also began to change. People who knew her before said she seemed quieter, more careful with her words. In interviews, she often repeated the same praises about Tom, calling him amazing and wonderful in ways that sounded rehearsed. While this could have been simple loyalty, some felt it lacked the warmth and spontaneity that once defined her personality. At the same time, Tom's involvement with Scientology only grew stronger. He became one of the church's most visible supporters, openly defending it against critics. To him, Scientology wasn't controlling, it was helpful. He believed it provided structure, discipline, and answers. From his perspective, he was building a safe and guided life for his family. But Katie didn't seem to share that comfort. As a Catholic, she struggled to fully understand Scientology's beliefs and rules. More importantly, she worried about what role it would play in her daughter's future. Tom's two adopted children, from his marriage to Nicole Kidman, had already become deeply involved in the church. For Tom, it was natural to assume Suri would follow the same path. For Katie, this was a frightening thought. As the years passed, Katie began to pull away quietly. She spent more time in New York, away from Tom. She reconnected with old friends. She appeared less often at Scientology-related events. On the surface, nothing dramatic was happening. But behind closed doors, she was making careful plans. What made this situation even more tense was the power imbalance. Tom Cruise was not just a husband. He was a global superstar with immense influence. Katie was younger, less powerful, and deeply aware of what could happen if she made the wrong move. According to people close to her, she began preparing in secret. She consulted lawyers, protected her communications, and planned every step with extreme caution. Then, in 2012, the unexpected happened. Katie filed for divorce. The news shocked Hollywood. There were no public warnings, no dramatic build-up. One moment they were married, and the next it was over. Even more surprising was how quickly the divorce was finalized. Within days, it was settled. Katie was granted full custody of Suri. After the divorce, everything changed. Katie moved permanently to New York with her daughter. Suri began attending school there, living a relatively normal life compared to her early years. Over time, Tom's public presence in Suri's life faded. He was no longer seen attending her school events. No photos of them together appeared. Years passed, and the absence became impossible to ignore. Tom continued his career, making blockbuster films and maintaining his public image. But when it came to his daughter, there was only silence. No interviews, no explanations, just distance. For many people watching from the outside, the question became impossible to avoid. Why would a father choose to stay away from his child? Some believed it was a personal decision. Others believed it was tied to his beliefs. But without direct answers, all anyone could do was watch and wonder. As Suri grew older, she slowly stepped out of the shadow of her parents' fame. She was rarely photographed, and when she was, it was usually with her mother. Katie Holmes focused on giving her daughter a stable, grounded upbringing. Suri attended regular schools, walked the streets of New York like any other teenager, and grew up far from the Hollywood spotlight. Then, as she approached adulthood, something subtle but powerful happened. Suri began using her mother's last name instead of her father's. It wasn't announced. There was no press release, no explanation, just a quiet change. To many people, this choice spoke volumes. Suri didn't give an interview. She didn't write a statement. She didn't accuse or explain. But in choosing how she identified herself, she sent a message that many interpreted as deeply meaningful. For some, it symbolized independence. For others, it reflected emotional distance. Either way, it reignited public interest in a story that had never truly ended. It's important to remember that Suri grew up without publicly acknowledged involvement from her father for most of her life. Children form bonds through presence, not promises, through shared moments, not distant admiration. As the years passed, Tom Cruise became more of an idea than a daily reality in her life. From Tom's perspective, those who know him say he never stopped loving his daughter. They believe his choices were shaped by belief, loyalty, and conviction, not a lack of care. To him, the path he followed was the right one, even if others couldn't understand it. From Katie's perspective, protecting her daughter came above everything else. She chose stability, familiarity, and emotional safety over fame and power. And she made that choice knowing it could come at a great cost. Suri, now grown, stands at the center of this story. Not as a victim, not as a spokesperson, but as a young woman making her own decisions. Her silence is not weakness. And in a world where everything is shared instantly, choosing silence can be the loudest statement of all. This is not a story about villains and heroes. It is a story about belief, power, love, and loss. About how even the most glamorous lies can hide deep fractures. And about how sometimes the truth doesn't come through words, but through the choices people make when no one is forcing them to speak. By the early years of the 2010s, what once looked like one of Hollywood's most magical love stories had quietly begun to fall apart behind closed doors. To the public, Tom Cruise and Katie Holmes still appeared polished, smiling, and united. They walked red carpets together, posed for cameras, and spoke carefully in interviews. But those who looked closely began to notice subtle changes. Katie's smile no longer reached her eyes. Her posture seemed guarded, as if she was constantly aware of who might be watching. Friends later said she moved carefully, spoke cautiously, and avoided saying too much in public. What once felt like a fairy tale had slowly turned into something filled with tension and fear. And at the center of it all was not fame, not money, but her young daughter, Suri. As time went on, Katie became increasingly focused on protecting her child and creating a future where Suri could grow up away from pressure, control, and intense public scrutiny. By 2011, many believe Katie had already begun thinking seriously about leaving the marriage. But this was not a normal breakup. It was something she approached like a long, carefully planned mission. According to later reports, Katie understood that leaving Tom Cruise was not as simple as packaging bags and walking away. Tom was one of the most powerful figures in Hollywood, deeply connected to the Church of Scientology and surrounded by teams of lawyers, assistants, and security. Katie reportedly believed that every move she made could be watched or tracked. So she stayed quiet. She smiled in public. She played her role. But privately, she began preparing. Reports claim she changed phones often, limited who she trusted, and slowly distanced herself from people she believed were connected to Scientology. Her father, Martin Holmes, a lawyer with years of experience, is said to have played a key role during this time. He had helped negotiate Katie's prenuptial agreement before the marriage, and now he reportedly helped her understand how to leave safely and legally. One of the most important decisions was where to file for divorce. Instead of California, Katie chose New York. Under New York law, courts are often more favorable to the parent seeking sole custody, especially when the child has primarily lived with that parent. This choice alone showed how focused Katie was on one goal above all others: protecting Suri. On June 29, 2012, the news finally broke. Katie Holmes had officially filed for divorce from Tom Cruise. The announcement shocked the world. There had been no public warning, no leaked arguments, no tabloid buildup. Even Tom himself later said he was completely blindsided by the news. He reportedly found out the same way the public did, through headlines. The timing made the moment even more dramatic. The filing came just days before Tom's 50th birthday, a moment that many believe was carefully chosen. To outsiders, it may have looked sudden, but in reality, it was the final step in a plan that had been forming for months.